Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Teresa J. Canada. And today, the topic will be de facto and de jure segregation, specifically as it relates to public schools or schools in general. So today, our special guest, or my guest, of course, the special, you all know that by now. But today, my special guest is Judge John W. Carter. And he will be focusing specifically on the legal aspects, the de jure piece of segregation. And I'll just talk briefly about the de facto segregation and how it applies to public schools. So I want to welcome Judge Carter.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. So let me just get started here. So during the 1900s, residential segregation throughout the United States accelerated, and which this led to de facto segregation, specifically in New York City. Now, my book talks a lot about desegregation and so forth and so on, but specifically the focus is on northern versus southern situations. So I think that it's good for our audience to learn more about this and how it relates to northern versus southern desegregation schools. So let me describe the separation of different groups, which could be based on people's characteristics of race, religion, ethnicity. It's not required, but it happens anyway. In essence, that's kind of like what de facto is. Now, let me provide a more specific example. If Blacks and whites live in the same neighborhood, but over time, they start to separate into different communities. De facto segregation is defined by some as an unintentional separation of racial, religious, or ethnic groups. But my question is it really unintentional? That's the question for today. And we'll talk more about that later on during the session. So let me give you an excerpt of one of the chapters in my book, which talked about how the New York City public schools, what would led them to consider looking at desegregating schools in New York City. Now, the 1954 Brown v. Topeka Board of Education court decision was basically the catalyst behind the aggressive move to desegregate the New York City schools. So in 1954, the Urban League of Greater New York asked Dr. Kenneth B. Clark, a noted psychologist, to provide a position paper on the problems of de facto segregation in New York City public schools. In his paper, Dr. Clark stated that, quote, de facto segregation was on the increase in New York City's public schools, and the quality of education that children in segregated schools received was continually deteriorating. Now, as a result of this presentation, the New York City Public Schools developed a committee to investigate ways to desegregate the city schools. And as everyone knows, that there was there was racial segregation in a sense of based upon the neighborhoods in which certain ethnic groups lived in. Having said that, we want to get some insight to whether or not that's something that's continually going to happen, or is it still happening, or is it decreasing? So those are things we need to think about when we talk about de facto segregation, that people kind of intentionally or unintentionally go into groups within communities, which in fact leads to possibly having segregated schools. So, Judge Carter, your turn. Let's see what you have to share about the de jure segregation, and maybe specifically talk about the court case. And I haven't shared, but you can share about the court case, but how the de jure definition applies to school segregation.
Well, de jure segregation is, or de jure anything, means by law. and specifically the juror segregation by law, which was the case in numerous of the southern states in the all the way up, leading up to the 1954 court decision. Of course, schools, as you mentioned, were also segregated in the North because of de facto segregation. That example that you use, groups separating in terms of their housing, where they would eventually end up in segregated schools because public schools were drawn by where you lived. So if you lived in a segregated area, you're probably going to end up having to attend a segregated school in the North.
Right.
So, well, my father worked in the NAACP. The NAACP is the group that brought the Brown Board of Education decision. He started working in the NAACP in 1944. At the time, there was only Thurgood Marshall, and there was another legal assistant marshal named Dudley, who lives in the development that you and I lived, I should say. And everybody knows Thurgood Marshall, but they started to challenge the theory of separate but equal. And they did it incrementally. In order to comply with separate but equal, schools in Oklahoma, schools in Texas would set up, the school in Texas actually set up a separate law school for a Black man. So he could go and they could comply with the law, separate but equal. So the NAACP took that case to court, and the Supreme Court found that, in fact, this so-called law school, this Black man was going to in Texas, was not in fact equal because it wasn't surrounded by the same type of students. They didn't have the same type of textbooks, teachers. So everything that makes a good law school was lacking in this particular place. So eventually, the NAACP decided to stop this incremental approach and to take a case to the Supreme Court that's separate but equal was inherently unequal.
Okay.
And resulted in the Brown v. Board of Education decision. The Brown v. Board was actually 5 cases. There was one from Kansas, which was Brown v. Board. There was one from South Carolina, one from Virginia, one from the District of Columbia, one from Delaware. They were all consolidated into one under the name Brown v. Board of Education. And my father was one of the attorneys. Well, he was the attorney who actually argued that case.
Tell me your father's name. I'm sorry, I didn't even mention your father's name. They don't know
Robert L. Carter actually argued Brown v. Board of Education.
What?
And Robert L. Carter eventually argued 22 cases before the United States Supreme Court, winning 21 of them. Now, what he did prior to the court argument, Brown v. Board, he had read an article by a psychiatrist who had written young Black students who would come up north to Philadelphia from the South. The longer they stayed in these Philadelphia integrated public and high schools, the higher their IQ rose.
Oh.
And so that was very intriguing to Dad. And what he eventually did, he asked this guy to testify. The guy said no, but the guy referred him to who? Kenneth Clark.
Okay.
The guy referred him to Kenneth Clark, and Kenneth Clark did this famous study with dolls.
Study.
He
Yes.
placed these white dolls and brown dolls in front of Black children. And he asked them, who was the prettiest doll? Who was the good doll? Who was the bad doll? Etc. Who was the doll most like you? In almost every instance, these Black children would point to the white doll and say, that's the good doll. That's the prettiest doll. That's the doll most like me because I'm also a good person. And it pointed to the black doll and said, that's the, and obviously this arose because of, the circumstances that they and their parents faced throughout their lives. So, Kenneth Clark did this famous study. The study was part of the trial record before the Supreme Court. And as we all know, the Supreme Court eventually ruled separate but equal was funny, in fact, and they relied on Kenneth Clark's testimony with the dolls. So, and as I said, my dad went on to argue a number of other cases before the Supreme Court, winning many of them.
Mhm.
He eventually became general counsel of the NAACP. And then when he went to a law practice, and he was appointed to the federal district court in the Southern District of New York in 1971. And he became a federal judge, remained that until he passed away.
Okay, so that's significant. But I appreciate you sharing with the audience the history, the stories about the dolls, and how all this led up to the reasons and the rationale and the support from Dr. Clark that enhanced the argument. Because the fact that a child, not we're talking about adults, we're talking about a child, was able to then look and felt almost inferior because of that experience. So I think that was a clear sign. And unfortunately, some of that still exists. There's still another researcher just came out recently, another dial study, and some of that still exists among young people. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do.
I want your listeners to know that, what I described was a very simplified form of what happened. But one of the things when we talk about Brown is although the NAACP had the help of white lawyers and other whites, this was mostly a group of black people, black men and women who decided to attack, segregation and develop this argument before the Supreme Court. And, Brown v. Board is now recognized as one of the most important decisions ever in the history of the Supreme Court, overruling Dred Scott, which said that, blacks were less than equal to anyone else.
Good point. Yeah, well, can you segue a little bit about the Dred Scott case? Because some of my audience may not understand what that case was about.
Well, Dred Scott was a case from the 1860s, which where the court ruled. I think they said that a black person was, equal to 7/10 of a white person, something like that. But that black people did not have the same rights as white people. Basically, that opened the door for Jim Crow.
Yes.
Everything that came after Jim Crow. That opened the door for these, black children looking at the white doll and saying that's the better doll. That's the prettiest. Brown v. Board of Education overruled Dred Scott, and Brown v. Board said that black people were entitled under the Constitution of the United States to the same rights white people had. Black people did not have to any longer rely on the goodwill or largesse of white people to secure those rights.
Good point. I want to just ask a little bit about some of the after effects of this is something that's come up even almost recently. Some of the after effects of the decision. Many now not so much. I think the same thing occurred in the North, but it just came to my attention over the last weekend. I was meeting with some other educators, and one of the facts that came up was that although which you just eloquently explained the purpose and issues related to the legal issues to that case, how can we take it from the legal and let people realize, what if you treated everyone the same way? We wouldn't have the issue to begin with. But does it have to take a legal decision, or does the legal decision determine the way in which people feel in general?
I think, it can't help. It can't hurt. It only helps it once you have the highest court in the land saying uh, uh, Black people are equal to whites, uh, and that segregation is no longer legal by force of law. I think, some people's attitudes
Then,
might change. Now, what happened, unfortunately, with the Brown case, although Brown was decided in 1954, after that, they had to decide, well, we've decided that uh, separate but equal is no longer legal. So what's the remedy? And they came up with this phrase that, many of us know, that the South and the nation had to comply with their ruling with all deliberate speed.
okay.
Meaning, the South didn't have to comply right away, but with all deliberate speed. And that was the first time in history, or maybe even since, that uh, a legal remedy, was not immediate. And what you had was, of course, you had the South
Yeah.
resisting, as we all know, the riots, the George Wallace standing by the schoolhouse door saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Correct.
So even though you had this ruling and this statement by the court, there was always resistance, and there's still resistance.
Yeah, that's the point.
But I do think that once you have a legal ruling that people have to comply with, I think that does make it easy.
it makes it easier to implement and make some change.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. So having said that, let's segue over into your experience. Now, knowing about this Brown decision, and what happened in 1954, that decision on what happened education moving forward. Share with me, did the Brown decision influence your educational experience in the North? Because you attended school in the North as well as I did. So can you give us a little background about your experience? And this a story you tell me about where you went to school before the schools you've changed and so forth. And so you've shared with me before in private about a situation with you, how your father moved you from middle school. Can you want to share that with the audience?
Yeah, sure. 1957, we moved from uh, a place called Riverton, which is on 135th Street between Madison and Fifth Avenues, which was a place where a lot of Black middle class in the late 40s and 50s lived, built by the same people that built Stuyvesant Town. I'm digressing here, but Stuyvesant Town was segregated.
Yes.
No Blacks to move in.
Yes.
No Rivertons. Anyway, we moved from.
That's a very historic piece. Share the information, because I want this to be a historical piece so people can learn. Because if they don't hear from you, they'll never know this. If people grew up in Harlem, had no idea that Stuyvesant Town was segregated. And so they built Riverton as an alternative to put the other folks in, right?
Other folks. So you had a lot of professionals, or people who became professionals, came out of Riverton. But anyway, so we moved. Once we moved, I had to change public schools. So I was placed in PS 125, which is right around the corner. And my father would always believe that education was the key to the key to living a good life, living a prosperous life, having a good job. Education was the key.
Okay.
He came to school one day and he saw kids running around with no discipline. He might have just come one day. I don't remember. It's long. as he described, we were all running around, we weren't learning, didn't seem to be any discipline. And he took me and placed me in a private school called New Lincoln, a place where I got a terrific education. But I don't know what New Lincoln, my class was maybe 40 to 50 kids, 40 to 50 in one grade. But there were very few Black people. So
Yeah.
even though I was getting this good education, I wasn't interacting with as many Black people as I had before. Friends were white. Most of my friends were white because your friends are who you know from school.
Right.
So that had a deleterious effect on me. Anyway, I ended up with this terrific education, and because of my father's experience and because of the fact that when I grew up, very impressionable, Supreme Court, unlike it is now, was very liberal, very forward thinking. That really influenced my decision to get into the field of law.
Yeah. Okay. So you want to give us some background about what your experience has been? It said judge, so I guess they got to know you were an attorney initially, so you got to become a judge.
Yeah.
So you want to share what your experience has been in the courts?
Yeah, I went to Columbia Law School, graduated from there, went to work at a law school, or what they call a corporate law firm. The work, I was there for 4.5 to 5 years. The work didn't interest me. I ended up leaving there and going to the Manhattan, New York County District Attorney's Office, where I prosecuted crime. And I worked there for 13 years. And then I was appointed as a criminal court judge in the city of New York, became a judge, and I sat in Brooklyn, and then I was transferred to the Bronx, where I moved up and became a Supreme Court judge, presiding over, again, criminal cases.
So the focus for your career has been mostly criminal versus civil.
Versus,
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Statewide. That's what my audience don't know. Everyone doesn't know the stages for judge. They think it's a state position, correct?
state position.
Okay. All right. Let me ask this question then. You think about your experience, and you were very adamant when you just mentioned how you had a great education at the New Lincoln School. And it goes back to the discussion many people have, because I know I talked about it in my book. Some of the young ladies in my book talked about why couldn't they have gotten that same education in their own neighborhood instead of having to leave and go to another neighborhood to be able to get the quality of education they received. So you're basically aligning what your experience has been with so many other people, especially the Black and brown professionals who end up going or making a difference. They have to go out of their own communities to go to better quality schools. So the key here again is quality. It goes back to quality. It goes back to one of the initial intentions for Kenneth Clark was saying, we've got to get quality education, because he felt at the time that the schools were segregated and the quality of education was not equal.
Was not the same. And this is your field. You know this more than I do. But I would suspect that the quality is still not the same, clearly. And you asked the question is why? Is it just resources? Is it parental involvement? I mean, what is it? Is it the quality of the teachers?
Good point. Good point. There's so many factors that people still can't pinpoint. And one of the things that came up, I was talking to another colleague about, when they desegregated schools, and more so in the South that we were talking about. I had to rephrase myself. Let me think about the North. When they took many of us out of the Harlem communities and East Harlem communities and sent us down, school down in the Southampton district of New York City, they never shifted and included any Black teachers. The students left, but none of the teachers.
None of the teachers. They didn't send the teachers down to the wealthier districts. Is that what
Exactly. There wasn't a single teacher of color in the school, not one. And I'm thinking, yes, this discussion has come up recently, like the fact that it's the teacher, for example, it was my first Black teacher that really gave me the impetus to say I could be smart, who told me I was smart. And I felt good about it. It wasn't like I was feeling bad about being smart, but that was a wake up call. And that allowed me to say, okay, I can do this. But that was not the same in the situation that I went to this other school out of my district. And we talked about how the role of Black teachers are now, how they were then. And so you bring the students to these schools, but you don't give them any other support. Like I said, only a handful of students of color. Okay. But they did not bring any teachers. So if you're going to be able to, you wonder what was that about? Because they didn't have all Black teachers in school where I attended. There was only a handful of Black teachers. Okay.
The teacher can have such a profound positive impact or negative impact on the student, as you described.
Right.
We've heard so many stories about, were it not for this teacher, I wouldn't have gone on to this profession. I would have dropped out of school. And if you don't have teachers that look like, that can be devastating. And if you don't have, Black teachers, maybe interacting with white students, the white student will just maintain their maybe views.
And that happens up to the point to higher ed. Now, to share this, it happened to me as a professor when a student didn't think that I was a professor because they'd never seen a professor who looked like me. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking to myself, really? So, but that says a lot about, our society, what we need to do more of. We need to have people who are visible in all the different levels, K through 12, and as well as college, to be able to, especially for the younger ages. I think it's adamant that we need to get exposure to early childhood education to make sure that students have certain teachers to be able to, they can engage it for everyone. Because if you don't see them, you'll never expect that they can, they never see people. I mean, there's some students who have never seen a Black teacher, that I'm like, really? And that's not to say that much has changed now, because of course the shortage of Black teachers is going into teaching, or people who are retiring out. So that's a concern for me. It's a concern because I'm thinking how, if you don't have someone who, like you said, looks like you, you're thinking, oh, what does that mean? I'm not saying that the other students don't think that way, but it also, like you said before, it allows the other students to see someone who doesn't look like them and be able to say, oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. And that's really what's missing. That's really what's missing. And I think we need more of that, in a sense, to be able to change things so that we can turn this around a little bit so people can all feel welcomed at the door, Because right now, it's a lot of hesitation. And I'm concerned now about, the resegregation of schools, which has been happening.
Here we are in 2023 talking about the resegregation of schools. And one could look back and say, well, not much has changed.
Exactly. That's a frightening thing. Okay. One of the things someone said to me, why did you write the book? I wanted to document the history, but history has repeated itself. All right. All the efforts, all of the legal issues that, that you expounded on, where has it brought us?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And where do we need to go from this point forward so that we don't forget about that? And the impact it had, because if it weren't for that experience, you may not have become the judge that you became. Think about that. Right.
Sure.
And I wouldn't have become necessarily the professor I became. So I think about that because I see that lacking in our educational system. And I'm concerned about now, especially when you have majority of students of color in the public schools throughout the country, especially major cities in the country. That's a big concern. So if we're not able to find a way to instruct to all, I teach people, it's teach to all, unteach to all, okay? Because they all need to see excellence in everybody.
Okay? Of course, in
everyone.
But we don't want to go too far down this depressing hole. So there must be some have to be some positives too. there must be people working on this issue now, like there were in my father's day.
Well, let's hope. I'm not really sure. Well, that I think that you're sharing the information, so people need to understand the history. Like when one of the students told me that she didn't know schools was segregated in the North, it just I was blown away. I said, "What? How? And this is a couple of years ago. Did
Mhm.
not know." And this is a person who wants to be a teacher. All right, who was unaware that she only knew that schools were segregated in the South. So I think even that was really something that would prompted me to get the voice out here and to put this on the podcast so people can learn the history. That's why I said sharing the history, people talking about the issues, because we need this, because what we don't want to do, Judge Carter, is to repeat the same mistakes.
Yeah.
Right?
My wife, my wife often uh, echoes what you said. She used to teach, she's retired at Hunter School of Social. She said there were so many students were very eager to learn, but there were so many things they didn't know about history, which is you kind of need to know history in order not to repeat it.
Yeah. And that's the challenge. That's one of the reasons why I decided to do this podcast. So educate people in different forums, to hear from the voices that are out there and issues. So I'm not going to keep too much, I just want to get to final thoughts on what do you think about the topics? We discussed, you think that this is something that's relevant, is helpful. What's your sense about today? What do you want to take away from today's episode?
No, I think it's very more relevant. I mean, anybody can listen to this and get a little bit of the experience, learn a little bit about the history. Maybe it'll spark someone to say, "Oh, this is a really important issue, and I want to be involved in this." I think what you're doing is getting people's view, getting people's out. I think it's very important. So I'm glad that you asked.
Thank you for participating. I think you bring a wealth of information, and plus you're my friend. What can I do, right? I have to ask my friend.
That's right.
If they say no, then I'm in trouble, right?
Yeah.
Well,
So,
thank you so much for this, this experience, and sharing your information, your knowledge, and just insight, about what we need to do moving forward. That's so important. Okay. And sharing about your father's life and his involvement with the Brown decision, which I don't think many people really know that. They need to know. They know the Thurgood Marshall person, but they don't know everybody else. And they didn't know that your father was arguing at the Supreme Court as well in his illustrious career. So I think that that's very, very important. And I really, really, really appreciate you sharing a story about your father coming to school and then taking you out of school, because that's basically what any parent will want. They want the best for their child. They want the best education for their child. And it all goes back to that. So I want to close by saying every parent wants the best for their child. And you just confirm that just from your experience and sharing the story about your father saying, okay, I gotta get you out of here to a better school. And I don't think that many people are aware of that happening for Black and brown people. They're not aware of that. They think, so I think that will help resonate with the people out or listening in the audience, how parents need to get involved and stay involved. That's at least one aspect of that hopefully they can take away from this, that parents need to still get involved and still champion for the best for their children, no matter what.
and if I can speak for him, I think he and others who work with him came to believe. They always believed that integration was the end all. Once you had integration, that would be it. Things would be better. But I think they came to believe, after all the resistance and all the fighting and the retrenchment by, certain aspects of society, that maybe integration was not the end. So
That's a nice way to, that's a great thought, because like I said, that one of the chapters, one of the young ladies in my book talked about why could we have gotten that same education in the school that we left.
yeah, right.
Okay.
Doesn't have to be. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So why do we have to leave our communities to go to those schools to get the education we should have had in our own?
Yeah.
Okay. So I thank you for sharing that story. I really appreciate it. Okay. Thank everyone for listening. I look forward to the next episode, and I want to thank Judge Carter for his insight and his exposure and his participation in this session. And we'll see you in the next episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. Have a great day, everybody.
And I hope you tell me when that is.
Hey, I will,
All right.
I will let you know. We'll be in touch. Hold on.
Please.
Judge Carter, thank you so much. And I'm going to pause with you, but I'll end our session with our audience.
Okay.